Hey everyone, I'm TM Sparrow, writer and homeschooling mom, and today I want to talk about my pre-writing process. As I mentioned in a previous video, I used to be a pantser. I know that works for some people, but for me, in 1 year as a converted planner, I've made more progress than I did in 7 years of pantsing. Now, in that same video, I also mentioned that I use Novel Factory's writing roadmap for my pre-writing process. And that's true, except that I have modified it a pretty good bit to work better for me. A mandatory reminder before I get started, I don't believe that there's any one correct way for everyone to do things. I'm sharing my method of pre-writing because Jenna Moressi's video on outlining is actually what got me started on researching all the different ways to do pre-writing. My hope is that by sharing my process, it might help someone else figure out what way is going to work for them. That said, let's get started. These are my 10 steps that take me from idea to first draft. Number 1, the idea. Every story starts with an idea. So I know I'm stating the obvious, but I feel like it would be wrong to skip this step. I actually have tons of ideas that I have made notes on or thought dumped to work on at a later point. I actually come up with my ideas in a lot of different ways. Sometimes they come from dreams or from music or conversations or even something that I've read. My current project, Asylum and the Children of Remus series, actually started from a live action role playing game. Lily, one of the main characters of the book, was my character in the game, and Brandon, who also shows up in the book, was my husband's character. So the idea started as a way to tie those two characters together, and it just grew from there. My Riders of Illyria series started with my love of dragons and dragon riders, and my eventual dissatisfaction with that genre. I'm actually working on my world building for this series while I'm writing the draft for Asylum, which is definitely not something that everyone does or even should do. Number 2, characters. Sometimes, like with Asylum, the characters come with the idea, but other times, like with my Riders of Illyria series, I have to create characters from scratch to work with my idea. This step can be really easy or it can be a lot of work, depending on the situation. With Asylum, it was pretty easy because most of the characters were already established in the LARP world. They just needed some refining and modifying to fit the new world that I was creating. The characters for Illyria were actually a lot harder because I had to come up with everything from scratch. Names, personalities, descriptions, just all of it. And that's a pretty involved process, character creation. So I may do a video on that later because I really do love my characters and I love to talk about my characters. Number 3, world building. So after, or sometimes even during character creation, I start building the world that my story is going to exist in. Again, this can be really difficult or really easy depending on the situation. For Asylum, that is set in modern day California. So really, all I had to figure out were my supernatural elements, like what kind of creatures exist, what the rules for magic are, how the shifter creatures and whatever else govern themselves, and what their mythologies are, things like that. And I guess that is actually kind of a lot, and in some ways I am still working on it, but a lot of that just comes from already established lore. I mean, it's a werewolf story. There's a lot to work with already. Illyria, on the other hand, is a complete fantasy world. So I am having to build everything from scratch. Every nation, city, and culture comes from me. And it has been a long process. And this is actually where I'm at right now for this story. And it's a pretty dense world, so I may have to scale it down a little. But really, that's all a part of the journey. Learning and growing and fixing what needs to be fixed. Number 4, the premise. This was actually a really new idea for me, but it's kind of become something that I view as an essential part of the pre-writing process. The premise is a single sentence that summarizes the entire idea of your story. And it really should contain all 5 of the major story elements in it. And those elements are character, situation, objective, opponent, and disaster. So it's who the story is about, the setting, the character's goal, who or what is working against the character, and what's at stake. And all of this comes in the form of a question. So, for an example, the premise of Asylum is taken to a secret base in rural California. How can Lily protect herself and her secrets in a hunter's stronghold when the cost of failure is not only her life, but all that she holds dear? So the reason that the premise has become such an important step for me is because having that single simple sentence that summarizes the main idea really helps make sure that I stay on track with the story and don't stray too far from the main point. Number 5, the outline. When most people think of an outline, they think about what we learned in school with the Roman numerals and headings and subheadings and every detail mapped out point by point. So I really don't blame people for not wanting to use this sort of dry, rigid structures to build their stories. I certainly don't want an outline like that. What I do is actually more of a story skeleton, which is what Novel Factory actually calls it. These are the bones of the story, the major plot points that fit in whatever story structure I'm using for that project. But the outline, or the story skeleton, is a really important step for me so that I can build on it for my next steps. You can kind of think of it like building a house. The premise is the foundation of the house. The characters are who's going to live in it. The world building is the neighborhood you're building in. And the story skeleton is the frame that you're going to build on. Number 6, the short synopsis. So now is when I get to start fleshing out my plot. Continuing with the house building analogy, the short synopsis is like putting the walls up on your house, adding a little structure to your frame. At this point, I take the sentence that I wrote for each plot point in the story skeleton and add a little detail to that. Basically, I expand it into about a paragraph. This step isn't really that difficult because I'm building on something that I already have. Usually, working on the outline has already given me ideas on how the main plot points are going to come about. The challenging part is actually to keep it short because this part doesn't need like dialogue or heavy description or anything like that. The point is to just have a brief summary of the events in the story. Number 7, the extended synopsis. So now is when I can take all these ideas that have been bouncing around in my head since I started working on my premise and story skeleton and everything and really start fleshing them out. I'm taking my short synopsis and again building from that and expanding it into something with a lot more detail. And specifically because I use the Novel Factory software, I dedicate one paragraph to every scene that's going to be in the story. This is the part where I get to add more specific details like who's in each scene and the locations of the scenes. And sometimes I might have to go back to the short synopsis or even the story skeleton and change some things around to keep everything cohesive. But I didn't really have to do that too much with this project. But then again, I have been working on it for almost 7 years. Number 8, locations. This is actually a pretty quick and simple step with the way that I do it. All I did for Asylum was look for some reference pictures and jot down a few detail notes about each location in the story. And really the hardest part of that was finding pictures that look like what I see in my head. Since this is just for a quick reference whenever I need it, I'm not really too strict on how much detail I put down. Number 9, scene summaries. So, after I have a better idea of my locations, I take my extended synopsis and break it down into individual scenes. Now, I mentioned earlier that when I'm writing my extended synopsis, I dedicate one paragraph for each scene. That's actually because the Novel Factory software will import each paragraph into the scene section for me as separate scenes. And that makes that my job that much easier. Because now all I have to do is take each of those paragraphs and expand it into a full summary for the scene. If you could see the scene summaries for Asylum, you would notice that some of them have a lot more detail than others. It really just depends on how much I actually know about the scene at that point. The more detail I have, the less work I will have to do to expand it for the actual draft. The less detail I have, the more work it is for future me. Number 10, the draft. Finally, it's time to start the real writing. And because I already have detailed summaries of what happens in every single scene, I don't really have to worry so much about writer's block or losing my plot threads. I always have something to come back to keep me on track. And it has made a huge difference for me. So yeah, I do have a bit of an extensive pre-writing process, but it did solve the problem that I was having with losing my plot threads halfway through my writing. So you can let me know in the comments below if you are a plotter or a pantser. Or you can find me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Tumblr. And if you want to see more, then don't forget to subscribe. I'll be posting new videos on Thursdays. See you next time.